Moments later, he drove his car off a 20-foot embankment. Bystanders rushed to help, pulling him from the car. Here are stories of those who ventured into Death Valley, and it didn't go as they hoped. Viewer discretion is advised. Kenny Veach's story starts innocently enough. A seasoned hiker with a thirst for exploration and a strange encounter in the desert that would lead to one of the internet's most debated mysteries. Kenny, a resident of Las Vegas, was no stranger to the desert. He hiked alone, far off the beaten paths, through rugged terrain where few dared to venture. In 2014, he left a cryptic comment on a YouTube video titled "Son of an Area 51 Technician." Under the username SnakebitMG, Kenny described finding a cave near Nellis Air Force Base. The entrance was shaped like a perfect M, unlike anything he had ever seen before. But what really caught people's attention was what happened when he tried to approach the cave. In his words, "My whole body began to vibrate. The closer I got, the worse it became. I got scared and hightailed it out of there. I've been hiking for over 20 years, and this was the strangest thing I've ever experienced." His story sparked fascination online. People encouraged him to go back, document the cave, and prove it existed. So Kenny obliged. He set out on a second trip to find the cave, this time with a camera and a handgun for protection. But despite retracing his steps, he couldn't find the cave. In a video posted to YouTube, he appeared frustrated, standing near an abandoned mine shaft, showing viewers what little he had discovered on that trip. The internet, though, is not a place for disappointment. Skeptics accused him of lying or backing down out of fear. Others, more invested in the mystery, urged him to try again. One commenter left an ominous message: "No, don't go back there. If you find that cave, you won't get out." Kenny didn't heed the warning. On November 10th, 2014, he set off again, this time telling his family it would be a short overnight trip. But Kenny never returned. Days turned into weeks, and his absence was eventually reported to the authorities. Search teams were sent out, combing the area where he had last been seen. On November 22nd, 2014, they found his cell phone near an abandoned mine shaft, deep in the desert. That was all they found. No sign of Kenny, no further clues. Speculation about his fate exploded. Did he fall into the mine? Did he succumb to the unforgiving heat and isolation of the Mojave Desert? Or was there something more sinister at play? Some believed he had found the mysterious cave and encountered something the rest of the world wasn't meant to see. Others suggested more practical causes like dehydration or even suicide. His girlfriend later left a comment on his last video, hinting at his long struggle with depression and her belief that he may have taken his own life. Despite extensive searches, Kenny Veach's body was never found. Death Valley had claimed another life, just like what gave it its name in the first place. Let's rewind the clock back to 1849, where another group lost themselves in this harsh landscape. The story of the lost 49ers began with a gold rush. Thousands of pioneers traveled west, lured by the promise of riches in California. Among them was a group known as the San Joaquin Company, who departed from Salt Lake City in late October 1849, a risky time to cross the Sierra Nevada mountains, as snow could make the path impassable. Their guide, Captain Jefferson Hunt, led the wagon train along the old Spanish Trail, but impatience grew as the journey continued. That's when a young man approached the group with a supposed shortcut. The map he carried promised to shave 500 miles off their journey. Most of the group, eager to reach California, decided to follow this route. As they pressed on, they soon realized this shortcut was anything but. The terrain grew more treacherous, the desert more unforgiving. After days of travel, they found themselves trapped in a deep canyon at the Utah-Nevada border. Discouraged, many turned back, but 20 wagons continued forward, crossing barren valleys and mountains until they reached the dry expanse that is now Death Valley. The journey became a nightmare. Oxen, weak from thirst and starvation, began to die. Families abandoned their wagons, walking in desperation across the desert, praying for salvation. A snowstorm provided a brief respite from the heat, but it wasn't enough to save them from the towering mountains that stood between them and freedom. By Christmas Eve, 1849, the survivors had stumbled into what we now know as Furnace Creek, deep in Death Valley. But their ordeal was far from over. With no way to scale the Panamint Mountains, two men, William Manley and John Rogers, volunteered to make the trek for help. They walked 300 miles across the desert, finally reaching a ranch in Southern California, where they gathered supplies and returned to rescue the families left behind. The group's eventual escape took nearly 2 more months, and as they finally crossed the mountains, one member is said to have looked back at the desolate valley and uttered, "Goodbye, Death Valley." There are people even today who try to take a shortcut through Death Valley, not heeding its fitting name. Two men on July 4th, 2023, tried to cross Death Valley, hoping for a shortcut and hoping for their GPS to figure it out. Instead, they found themselves stranded when their Chevy Malibu got stuck in the mud, miles from help. In Death Valley, where temperatures soar to over 130 degrees and cell service is non-existent, being stranded is the last thing you want. So with their car trapped and no way to call for help, the two men were left with no choice but to walk. They managed to make it to Badwater Road, but their journey didn't end there. They continued for another 12 miles through the dark, unforgiving desert with the scorching heat at their backs. Exhausted and running out of options, they made a decision that every survival expert will tell you to avoid. They split up. One of the men was eventually picked up by a couple of visitors around 8 a.m. and was taken to Furnace Creek, where he was able to call for help. Fortunately, his companion was found not long after, suffering from heat illness, but alive. You'd think that surviving such an ordeal would be enough punishment, but their troubles weren't over yet. The men were charged for illegally driving off-road and causing damage to the park. It's safe to say, though, that they were likely just grateful to be alive. That shortcut through the desert almost cost their lives. There are those who enter, though, precisely because it provides the most challenging physical conditions. In particular, there are those who choose to do Badwater 135 Ultra Marathon. This race covers a brutal 135 miles, starting at the lowest point in Death Valley and ending at the Mount Whitney portal. Runners push through scorching temperatures, often over 120 degrees Fahrenheit, with little to no shade. Remarkably, despite the grueling conditions, none have died during this extreme race. But not everyone who runs in Death Valley is so fortunate. Among them was Michael Popov, an ultra runner who sought the thrill of pushing his body to its limits in the hottest place on Earth. Michael was no stranger to extreme environments. He had completed grueling races all over the world. But in July 2015, he set out to conquer Death Valley alone. His goal was to run nearly 40 miles in one of the most hostile climates imaginable. With temperatures soaring above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, the heat became unbearable. Armed with only a limited supply of water, Michael pressed on, determined to finish his solo trek. But as the heat intensified, his body began to falter under the strain of dehydration and exhaustion. 2 days later, his body was found. Severe dehydration had claimed his life. Despite all his experience, even Michael couldn't conquer the brutal extremes of Death Valley. But what if you didn't even mean to go to Death Valley in the first place? Take Albert and Rita Chrétien, a couple from Penticton, British Columbia, who set out on March 19, 2011, for what should have been a straightforward trip to Las Vegas. They had been married for 38 years and were on their way to a trade show, driving their Chevrolet Astrovan. They'd purchased a GPS unit for the journey, thinking it would make the trip smoother. But what they didn't know was that this GPS would lead them straight into the wilderness. Their planned route took them through Idaho, but as the day wore on, they veered off course, trusting the GPS to find them a shortcut through the mountains. As they drove deeper into the backcountry, the road became rougher and more remote. Soon, they found themselves in a place where even their van couldn't handle the terrain. Without realizing it, they had driven into the high desert, a vast and barren land with few signs of life. And then, their van broke down. For days, the Chrétiens were stranded in the wilderness, with no cell service and no one knowing where they were. Friends and family grew worried when they didn't arrive in Las Vegas, and a massive search was launched, involving police agencies across 4 states. Despite the efforts, the couple's location remained a mystery. On April 8th, nearly 3 weeks after their disappearance, the search was scaled back. The sad reality was setting in. Albert and Rita had become victims of what park rangers call death by GPS, when over-reliance on technology leads people into life-threatening situations. By now, you may think that the only danger is the heat. Flooding definitely would not be something you'd think to worry about. But on August 5, 2022, flash floods swept through the park after a heavy rainstorm dropped 1.7 inches of rain in just a few hours. That might not sound like much, but in Death Valley, where the average yearly rainfall is only 1.9 inches, it was enough to turn the desert into a raging river. Cars were buried under debris, roads were completely washed out, and around 1,000 people were stranded, unable to leave the park. One photographer, John Serlin, who had been trying to capture shots of lightning before the storm, found himself caught in the chaos. From his vantage point on a hillside, he watched as entire trees and boulders were washed down the mountains. The sound of rocks crashing down was deafening, and the water flowed several feet deep across roads, making any escape impossible. Serlin, along with many others, were trapped for hours as the floodwaters raged around them. By the time the water finally receded, the damage was done. Cars were smashed, dumpsters had been pushed into vehicles, and buildings were flooded. Death Valley might be known for its heat, but flash floods can strike with little warning, turning the landscape into a deadly trap. Even to this day, names like the hottest place on Earth or Death Valley don't make people approach with enough caution. On August 1st, 2024, Peter Hayes Robino, a 57-year-old hiker from Los Angeles, set out on the short Natural Bridge Trail. It's just a 1-mile hike, but in temperatures soaring above 119 degrees Fahrenheit, even the shortest walk can become dangerous. As Peter made his way back to the trailhead, other hikers noticed that something was wrong. He was stumbling, his responses didn't make sense, and he seemed confused. Despite offers of help, Peter declined and continued on his way. Moments later, he drove his car off a 20-foot embankment, crashing at the edge of the parking lot. Bystanders rushed to help, pulling him from the car and moving him to a shaded area. But it was too late. By the time park rangers arrived, Peter's condition had worsened, and despite CPR, he was declared dead at 4:42 p.m. The cause? Heat stroke, a deadly condition where the body's temperature rises to dangerous levels. Death Valley had claimed another victim, and the park officials once again issued warnings to visitors. Avoid hiking during the heat of the day, drink plenty of water, and never underestimate the dangers of the desert. It's a lesson that tragically comes too late for many. So before you set foot in the desert, make sure you're prepared, know the risks, and always have a plan for when things go wrong. Because in Death Valley, sometimes the smallest mistake can have the biggest consequences. And if you've made it this far, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more stories like these. Stay safe out there, and we'll see you on the next adventure.